Welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. Steve Meyer here, and we're going to wrap up my series entitled Heavy Music Visionaries, Inventors, Innovators, and Followers. All right. And in this last part 7, what I'm going to do is basically summarize what I consider 5 key points, 5 key takeaways, I suppose, of this essay and indeed this series. Okay, so let's dig into it. And as always, you can check out the full text, links provided below if you'd rather read about this stuff. Okay, so in wrapping things up, why does all of this matter? Why have I made such a big deal about this in writing a paper and putting together a YouTube series? Okay, well, I think this all goes beyond just an academic exercise, although it is indeed partly that as well. For many years, some commentators have made light of rock and roll, right? Same 4 chords played over and over, super simple, all that. They've made light of hard rock. It's just music for partiers. It's for rebels. It's for kids, right? Implying you just sort of grow out of this stuff. But they've especially made light of heavy metal, right? It's just stupid music for stupid people. It's music for degenerates. Or it's just noise, right? Okay, well, obviously I don't agree with those things, but such has been consensus from big parts of society over time. On the other hand, though, there are those who will tell you that serious music, for smart people and grown-ups, doesn't come in the form of, say, heavy metal. It comes in the form of jazz, classical, perhaps adult contemporary, and maybe on a good day, they'd be willing to throw alternative rock a bone here and there, right? And again, I'm not saying that these aren't serious forms of music and that people shouldn't be listening to it. It's great stuff, and you should if you like it, of course, right? But I take issue with the fact that heavy metal and hard rock are never put in those categories. Or others might say, if discerning listeners are interested in something a little simpler, so you don't want to listen to classical and jazz, for example, and you want to avoid the negative connotations that society, kind of lobs at you, one could safely listen to, say, the blues, which is simple but much more acceptable by society, country and western, or perhaps even pop, right? In fact, today, even the once vilified punk rock, right, is viewed by many as worthy of exploration, even in one's more senior years. And I completely agree with that as well. And frankly, I have no problem with people not liking heavy metal. That's not sort of the point I'm trying to make here. I mean, indeed, any form of adventurous entertainment's not going to be for everyone. So fair enough. I don't have a problem with that. But don't tell me that heavy metal or indeed hard rock lacks validity as distinguished art forms, because I think they absolutely do. If we value inventions, innovations, or even interesting repackaging of countless consumer products and services, then I believe the same courtesy should be bestowed upon music, including heavy metal. Right? This essay went to some length to discuss heavy metal and hard rock under this framework of invention versus innovation. Okay? That's sort of been the overarching theme of this entire series. Okay. By way of conclusion, I think 5 key points are worth reiterating. All right. First, I think this paper adds to the discourse on heavy music by providing some clarity on the differences between hard rock and heavy metal. Because let's face it, those 2 art forms get mixed up a lot, right? In fact, a lot of people think they're basically interchangeable, hard rock and heavy metal, right? I certainly don't. And I think the most crucial distinguishing feature is that hard rock is an innovation, all right? It's an innovation on what came before, as all innovations are. And it's chiefly an outgrowth of rock and roll. Right? Whereas I believe heavy metal is a new invention. Of course, it's also an outgrowth of rock and roll, and before that, blues and rhythm and blues, etc. But heavy metal became distinct enough that it should be viewed as a new invention. right? An innovation is based on something that came before. It could be a significant change of it, but it's based on what came before. An invention is something that's effectively a new thing. And I believe heavy metal is a new thing, or what became a new thing, right? Some of the key characteristics of heavy metal that distinguished it from hard rock, for example, it's unorthodox speeds, whether it be really fast or really slow. It's unsettling negativity and or brutality set metal apart, right? It's unprecedented heaviness in musical delivery, definitely. The physically and mentally demanding levels of skill to play heavy metal, to perform it, and also to comprehend it is there. And in some cases, metal's highly unconventional and complex songwriting, right? I think these are all very strong distinguishing features, and there would be others, right? These are things I've discussed in much more detail in other parts of the series, of course. Okay. I believe, though, it's important to understand that the artists themselves do not always neatly conform to one or the other, right? They don't neatly conform that they're purely metal or purely hard rock, for example. And I believe this is what really creates a lot of the confusion, okay? That we need to understand heavy metal and hard rock, for example, based on the typical characteristics of the music, not necessarily try to understand it by those who play it. Okay, if you get what I'm saying. For example, Judas Priest, widely considered the epitome of heavy metal, right? And they are in some ways. They do play a lot of metal, no doubt about it. But they also play a whole lot of hard rock throughout their distinguished career. Okay, at the other end of the spectrum, take a band like Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin would almost always be pigeonholed as a rock band, maybe a hard rock band, but nobody will call Led Zeppelin a heavy metal band typically. Right? But you better believe Led Zeppelin has a lot of metal moments in their discography, right? Proto metal moments, right? They were indeed one of the co-inventors of heavy metal, I would argue, right? So again, I think that's what confuses people. You know, that Zeppelin, for example, a rock band, had their metal moments. And what also doesn't help, you've got Jimmy Page and Robert Plant were consistently offended by any form of metal tagging, for example, right? Okay, so, but nevertheless, the heavy metal invention, hard rock innovation declaration that I've been making in this series, that's not changed by the fact that some musicians may weave between the two, and lots of them do, or how musicians might self-identify, or even by how critics and fans might categorize different bands, right? And so I think understanding these concepts keeps things much clearer, I believe. So hard rock's the innovation, you know, an outgrowth of what came before. Heavy metal's a new invention. It is an outgrowth, but it's distinct enough that it should be called an invention. And you'll get confused if you try to define either by what bands might play, because some bands will play both. They'll interchange it. Okay, that's what helps keep it separate, I believe. And better and easier to understand. Okay, second contribution of this series in this paper. Because heavy metal is an invention, there's a logical curiosity to determine the inventor. Okay, that's just logical, right? The problem is, in this situation, it's just not that neat and simple. Attaching this designation to a sole inventor simply doesn't work in practice here. Even for those who want to give this crown to the mighty Black Sabbath. That's what we hear the most. Who invented heavy metal? Okay, if heavy metal's an invention, there's got to be an inventor. Who invented heavy metal? Well, that's got to be Black Sabbath, right? Okay, there's a problem with that. Now, I should say from the onset, I have no problem with stating that no band has had more influence on the development of heavy metal than Black Sabbath. But there's way too many valid arguments that can be made for the inclusion of countless co-inventors to conclude this debate in such a narrow fashion, which we often do. All right. And again, there's one episode in this series where I talk about this at length. Unfortunately, this is not a question that has a nice, concise answer that we often look for, no matter how badly some heavy metal fans want to have one. In other words, How can the contributions of Led Zeppelin, Uriah Heep, Deep Purple, Jimi Hendrix, Cream, and others, perhaps many others, be discounted? In addition to Black Sabbath, of course, right? In truth, there were multiple contributors to the formation of heavy metal. And yes, everybody's list is likely to be different, such as the inherent subjectivity of art. Okay, that's fair enough. But so in other words, what I would have on my list as co-inventors of heavy metal will probably be different from your list of co-inventors of heavy metal. But what I'm quite darn sure about, it's not one band. It's way more complex than that. So I believe that's another contribution of what I'm doing here in this series. A third one. Heavy metal's many subclasses can also be put into a logical context. We can understand how the subclasses evolved also using this format, I believe. In my view, there are both innovations and inventions at work here, okay? So the subgenres emerging in the late 80s and beyond, again, so heavy metal fragmented quite a bit, as a lot of people know, into death metal, black metal, thrash metal, prog metal, power metal, funk metal, on it goes, right? These are innovations on the original heavy metal construct that came out in the 60s and 70s. So heavy metal was invented once by a bunch of co-inventors in the late 60s, early 70s. But when it fragmented into the subgenres, those weren't new inventions to me. They were different significantly and quite distinct, sure. But they were innovations on the original heavy metal blueprint, or at least that's how I see it, right? But here's another thing to add to this, though. Complementary inventions that predate any form of heavy metal were used in a new way, and that's what allowed the subgenres to evolve and become reasonably distinct, right? And these complementary inventions were, for example, fast palm muting and downpicking in thrash metal, distorted vocals in death metal, and blast beat drumming in black metal, just to name a few, okay? So I believe by viewing heavy metal's evolution in this manner, certain points of contention can be put into a different and hopefully clearer light. For example, and just to name a couple, and again, I talk about this in a lot more detail in other parts of the series, but Creator's innovative brand of thrash metal, Immortal's state-of-the-art black metal, or Eddie Van Halen's game-changing tappings were not new inventions, okay? They were just exciting variations, i.e. innovations on what came before, all right? Or at least that's how I sort of see this all fitting together. Okay, fourth contribution of this series. Not every heavy artist can be considered a co-inventor of heavy metal or a key innovator that helped push heavy metal or hard rock into interesting new territories. All right, fair enough. I mean, I've really emphasized the inventors and innovators in this series, but not everybody can fit into those categories. Lots of groups have essentially followed scene leaders, either one in a fairly linear fashion, for example, such as how doom metal band Trouble more or less picked up where the Ozzy era Sabbath, left off, or perhaps even redid a lot what Ozzy era Sabbath did, or two, by amalgamating in sort of a hunters and gatherers way and incorporated strong ideas from several other artists. And the example I use in the series is sort of what Lamb of God does. They're amalgamators. They take some of the most interesting parts of Pantera, Slayer, two very innovative bands, by the way, and some hardcore stuff in creating their hybrid sound, right? Okay, I don't see either, whether you're linear like Trouble and sort of redoing Sabbath, or you're amalgamating like Lamb of God does. I don't see either as particularly, they're not inventors and they're not innovators, right? While it's important to identify this category of non-inventors and non-innovators, and there's lots of them in heavy music, I think it's also crucial not to judge these artists too harshly. I don't think we should look down on them necessarily. I look at it this way. If a band offers music that essentially redoes what's been done, but They play it exceptionally well. They perform with lots of charisma. They might display dazzling technique and or write derived yet interesting songs. Then great. What's not to love about that, right? AC/DC's Angus Young has stated many times that there's nothing new about his band's Chuck Berry on overdrive approach, but how many hard rock or heavy metal fans have not been entertained by their albums? I mean, some of my favorites, how can't you be entertained by Let There Be Rock or Power Age or Flick of the Switch or even the most recent Power Up, right? My guess is very few. AC/DC, they're followers to the bone, but how can't you be entertained by that incredible band is sort of my point. So there's room for lots of bands. You don't just have to be an inventor or an innovator as far as I'm concerned. Okay. Fifth, at the other end of the spectrum, some distance from the followers, of course, would be those artists that are truly progressive, either in the label sort of sense of the word or more generally, right? The prog metal subgenre contains a stable of heavy artists who represent the very elite in terms of creative spirit, right? So much so that I can understand why some may see this category as actually a new invention and not just an innovation on the original heavy metal blueprint. I don't go that far, but prog metal is, very innovative. So again, some of the artists that push the music form furthest, far into the future, if you like, or build so much on what's done before that some might say, hey, prog metal really should be called a new invention. I don't see it as such. I think it's still an outgrowth on the heavy metal blueprint, although an incredibly innovative one, right? I do, however, view the emergence of progressive or prog rock in the late 60s and early 70s as a true invention, and frankly, the only type of rock that does not have direct lineage to rock and roll, right? So for me, prog metal is an outgrowth of heavy metal, an outgrowth of prog rock, or most likely both. That's how I see it. So it's still an innovation, an incredibly important one nevertheless. All right, at any rate though, there's no question that the most restless explorers in heavy music are those that fall into one of two categories. They're either squarely within the prog category, right? So that could be prog metal, prog rock, heavy prog, whatever you want to call it. So bands such as King Crimson, Jethro Tull, Rush, Dream Theater, Arena, Queensryche, Porcupine Tree, etc., right? Or those bands or artists that are typically allocated to other subclasses but have clearly defined progressive tendencies. So they might be a band that's, we typically categorize in black metal, but they have strong progressive tendencies in what they do, right? They're also incredibly important innovators in terms of music. So who would bands like that be? Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Iron Maiden, Voivod, Metallica, Death, Opeth, Enslaved, etc., 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 right? And of course, I talk about these bands in more detail in other parts of the series as well, right? In many ways, the essence of this essay that attempts to appraise heavy music in the context of invention and innovation was written with these artists in mind. So the true proggers or the bands that are not allocated as prog but have strong progressive tendencies, right? The progressives in general, if you want to call them that, are what have kept the heavy music wheel rolling for decades and likely always will, right? So I think that's the fifth takeaway from this paper, how important the progressives are to heavy music in general. Again, especially in pushing it forward. So that's the series. I want to thank anyone, especially who went through the whole thing, all 7 parts. Thank you very much. But also, thank you so much for anyone who's just watched parts of this or whatever. I really appreciate it. Your time is, I guess I can't thank you individually, but I do appreciate it. And I'll be back with another series or something sometime down the road. So I wish everyone all the best out there. And I'll see you around sometime, probably.